Welcome back. So in the last lesson, we took a look at how to use this query component that we got from React Apollo. We used it by passing in a literal query using the GQL function that we used in order for us to make a request to this query, which will then give us back our data as well as a loading state and error state if anything happened there, so that we can handle in this function what we want to actually render. Now, in this section, let's actually use a different query that we've already seen before, and let's query for our collection by the title based on our collection param. So as you remember, we currently use a selector inside of our collection component to handle this. Inside of this collection component, we are doing it like so. Well, this is not going to work for us anymore because we don't use Redux. So let's strip this out. Let's get rid of this connect, and let's remove the actual dependencies themselves. Now this component is still going to just receive the collection. And we're going to actually pass it to it from the collection container that we're going to build. So we're going to say collection.container.jsx. And inside of this container, we are going to import in React from React, because as we know, we're writing a component. We're going to import in that same query component from React Apollo. We're going to import in GQL. So nothing is new here. We're not importing anything differently. And then we're going to import in the collection page itself. And here we need the component, and we also need the spinner. From spinner, spinner component. Okay, so we have all our imports. Now, in order for us to make this query, we actually have to write it out a little differently. Most of it is going to be the same. The only difference is that we're going to type this out again. Get collection by, by title equals GQL, and then our string interpolation. So nothing different. Here we're going to say query, as we normally do, except what we're going to pass into this query is this term get collections by title. We're going to give it the brackets, and here we're going to say $title, which is a string. So what this means is that we're saying that we want to make a query request, right? Using a query in our server that we're used to seeing. So we want to make this query. And here we define the shape of what it expects. So we're going to say that what we're going to get here is an object called $title. And the reason we're going to do this is because out of this, we're going to put our brackets, and we're going to say get collections by title here. And here we're going to pass the title property with our $title value. So I'll explain to you why we have to do this. Because when we make this request, we actually have to pass into this query request, when we actually write out our query component, this title variable that it's now suddenly expecting. So what we're saying is that this title value that we're going to get is going to be a string. And what we want to set it to is the actual title that the query itself is expecting in the backend. It's just the way that we have to write it. It seems verbose, but this is just the way that GraphQL expects it. After that, we can pretty much just say, once we get back our object, these are the data values that we want. So we want the ID, we want the title, and then we want our items, ID, name, price, and image URL. So that's the same. The biggest difference is just that when we define this query, if we want it to be dynamic, right, in the sense that we want to pass a title through to it, we got to use and leverage this syntax where we almost seem to write it twice, because we define the query, we define what type it's expecting, and then we define actually what we're going to have to make against it, right? And then we define the variable that we're going to pass it in as. If this seems confusing, it'll make sense once we write this next section, because we're going to say const collection page container is equal to us getting our match object, because we're going to replace this inside of our route component on our shop page. So we're going to get our match history. We only want the match though. And here what we're going to say is we want to render out the query. And what we want to pass into the query is this query key, where the query goes to this get collection by title query. Now, in order to pass the variable in, we actually have to do it here. So here we're going to say variable equals, and then it's going to be an object where the name of the variable that we want to pass in, so we want to pass the title variable in, is going to be the actual value. So here we're going to say match.params.collection ID, right? Which is what we were using for our parameter. And now, inside of the function that we get back, we are going to destructure off the loading and the data. And off the data, now that we know, we want our get collections by title. So as we remember, when the data comes back to us, the actual object is going to be the name of the query itself. And we knew that this name was this name. So once we have our object, what we're going to render is we're going to say if loading, then return the spinner. Otherwise, return our collection page. So if you want here, you can actually use a ternary operator instead of this if statement. So collection here is going to go to our get collections by title, which might look a little confusing, but that's just the property name on data that our actual collection object is nested under. So once we've done that, let's just go over what we did. This variables key is the way that we pass in variables that our dynamic queries are expecting. We have to pass them in with the value matching the actual value that we want to pass into the query. You just got to remember the first thing that you define will be the actual name of the query that you're making against. So once we have that, we export this out as our default. And then we're going to go to our shop page component and just replace our collection page the same way we did earlier with our collections overview. And we're going to set default as collection page. And if we save this, go back to our application, go to our hats page, we'll see that it works. This is now fetching against our database for our one specific collection. We used our new get collections by title in order to get the actual item. And it's almost as if we are selecting against our backend, right, in order to make this query. So you'll kind of feel like what we're writing is functions in order to fetch data from our backend. And that's one of the cool things about using Apollo and GraphQL, is that it almost just feels like we're treating our database as something that's part of our front-end application. It doesn't feel as much like we're using promises that much anymore, because so much of the promises is hidden away by Apollo. So that's one of the really nice things about working with it, is that you don't have to spend so much time thinking about what promises am I going to resolve, right? Do I need an async await here? It pretty much all gets extrapolated away for us. So now that we've seen how to fetch data from a backend, we can actually also leverage Apollo for more than that. So you might be thinking, well, this is great and all, right, for things that we fetch from a backend, but what about our front end? What about data that we store on our front end? Do we still have to pass it around and fetch it every time using these queries? And what about data like our cart? We can't make requests against our backend in order to store our cart, right? We still might have to use Redux. Well, that's actually not the case. Apollo has pretty much brought that into the front end as well. And they have their own solution that lines up with how we're making our queries so that it's a unified way of making requests against a backend server as it is against making a request for local data. And I'll show you how we can do that in the next lesson.